a lot of the Maronite population of Lebanon, and this was probably just because he was not aligned with the Maronite political class. But anyway, so when the Lebanese Civil War happened, Rome really asked the Patriarch, please, you have to stay non-partisan. You really can't take side. And Quraysh, he respected this, and of course, by doing so, respects the original pact made with the Catholic Church in the 18th century. That the Catholic Church has quite a bit of dominion over what happens within the Maronite Church. And of course, this was not a very popular position. Bashir Jumayyid says, I think this was on television, that the Vatican should understand that Christians in Lebanon are not guinea pigs for the Christian-Islamic dialogue in the world. So yeah, we shouldn't really, I think, take this to say that, or to mean that there's an expectation for the Vatican to express a kind of xenophobia. People like Bashir Jumayyid and the Jumayyids amassed much of their power before the civil war in Lebanon from sort of Syrian and Arab money, and which are overwhelmingly by Muslims bringing money into the country. So yeah, I don't think the point is xenophobia at all. I think it's really a want to maintain sort of political control. Yeah. And this is a photo of Bashir Jumayyid on the far left, and on the far right you have Ilyas Saadi, who is a Lebanese-American businessman, and in the middle you have Frere Sherb al-Assis. And Sherb al-Assis basically led a group of renegade Maronite priests who basically were to ignore the Maronite Patriarch's orders to remain sort of non-partisan, and Sherb al-Assis basically led these sort of militant priests into military activity. This was later sort of reined in by the Patriarch and by the Catholic Church. There was a lot of effort to discredit these people, and to a large extent, this succeeded. This renegade group of Maronite priests didn't really grow. It was sort of suppressed and ended relatively fast. And after the Civil War, you actually do have a reconciliation between the Vatican and the Christian right here. You see the Pope this is, excuse me, just to make sure, because there's two different popes. Yeah, here, this is a photograph of Pope John Paul II, not Paul IV, Paul IV was the Pope during the Lebanese Civil War. John Paul II is the Pope right after the Lebanese Civil War. But anyway, here John Paul II is saluting or saying hi to Jocelyn Khoury, who's maybe the most famous militia woman on the Christian right. Okay, so really the idea behind this chapter is to talk about how, or at least provide proof of how heresy maintains a kind of identity, and how this is very specific to Catholic Reformation. And we'll conceptualize this further in the next chapter, which, if I'm not mistaken, I believe is the final chapter. So, transhistorical dynamics. So, much of the affirmations of the Second Vatican Council are quite analogous to Protestantism. Even the affirmations which I argue were not fully sort of practiced or actualized, they still say something about the nature of the Second Vatican Council and the nature of specifically Catholic Reformation. Okay, so we know the famous book by Max Weber, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, basically aligning Protestantism with capitalism, which is the motor of modernity. Okay, so for example, giving a larger role to lay people, this is an affirmation of the Second Vatican Council. And of course, as you probably know, one of the basic tenets of Protestantism is that, in a way, there's no difference between the priest and the lay person or the churchgoer. They're sort of equalized on that level, and you can critique a priest because a priest might have a sort of vested interest. And just to relate this more rigorously to modernity, you have the famous line from Marx that with modernity, all that is solid, all that was sort of these old institutions that were there and seemed natural throughout history, they melt into air. And this division, this very binary division between priest and lay person is, I think, very characteristic of pre-modern times. It's the same as the very binary distinction between noble and peasant. When you're a noble, you inherit this status, and you will kind of always be a noble, or at least your bloodline sort of will always be noble. Whereas the bourgeois, which is the class of modernity, are characterized by that their class position is not eternal, that it is subject to change. If you sort of lose your money, you are no longer a bourgeois. So this melting away, or equalization, to stay consistent with my vocabulary, between the noble and the peasant is very much analogous to the equalization between layperson and priest. Celebrating Mass in local languages, of course, as you know or might know, the Protestant Reformation was catalyzed by the Gutenberg press, or mass production basically, and had it not been for mass production, I really think it's doubtful that you would have had a Reformation. Not enough people might have been able to read it, but anyway, the real idea is that this affirmation of the Second Vatican Council, this notion of celebrating Mass in local languages is very, I think, it has something of Protestantism in it, because also Protestantism very much affirmed that Latin is not this deified language. You can really read scripture in whatever language you want. What's important is the content of scripture. Whereas interaction with the modern world, I think, or I hope, is self-evident because, again, interaction with the modern world is an affirmation of the Second Vatican Council, and it's analogous to Protestantism because Protestantism is an inherently modern process. And by modern, I mean modernity. I don't mean simply contemporaneous. Okay, so Christian unity. Obviously, as we saw from the Redemptorists meeting minutes, there was really not much Christian unity. There was very much a meeting of Catholics. However, this very notion of wanting to affirm Christian unity says a lot about this Protestantization, which is inherent to the Second Vatican Council. Okay, so these are two extracts from two interviews I conducted with two missionaries. They were schoolmates of mine, but they were missionaries. So I asked the person on the left, Ochinga, what is your specific denomination? He says, I'm a non-denominational Christian, which falls under Protestantism. This other missionary, Vanessa Gentry, I asked her the same question. She says, my father has always answered when asked what denomination he is, I am simply a follower of Christ. So yeah, I think this is a very, very Protestant tendency because it really disavows the importance of institution and really just, it sort of circumvents the church and goes directly to scripture or goes directly to Christ. And this idea of being a non-denominational Christian, I think, is inherently Protestant. And a little metaphor I like to use to make things clear, that Protestantism has the word protest in it. Although in terms of etymology, Protestantism does not come from the word protest, but I think the fact that it has the word protest in it can explain something about it. And so a protest, I think, is something which is non-partisan, which is disinterested, and protest is often associated with sort of the people and populism, and therefore is sort of put in contradistinction to vested interests. So this idea of being a non-denominational Christian, I think, is very Protestant, and yeah, that's and very secular. That's I call Protestantism also a secular Christianity. Okay, so start a dialogue with other religions. Yeah, we saw that the Redemptorists and the Catholic Church did do this, but this idea of relating to other religions, I think, is something which is also very deeply intertwined with Protestantism, or is very important to Protestantism. So again, we have this this image of Howard Bliss. I talked about it several times, but you understand the idea, I think, by now, that there's an equalization of these Abrahamic religions, but also on the Muslim side of things, you have someone like Mahsen Amin. In the sort of 19th century context of the Levant in general, you had a fear amongst many Muslim clerics of a Protestantization of Islam. And a few decades later, you had this person, Mahsen Amin, who was an Islahist, and what Islah means is just reform. So yeah, it's very, very direct. He's actually my great-grand-uncle, and I think his Reformation, his Reformation failed, in my opinion, because there was no secession, but it's really not that important for this context. So, to really understand Protestantism, I think you have to understand this sort of inverse, two inverse qualities of it, or this inverseness that's in it. So with Protestantism, you have an external deterritorialization. Like we said with Howard Bliss, that there's this sort of equalization, and this even extends to reformations outside of Christianity. And I would even say that the Counter-Reformation can be put under a larger Protestant process of atomization. So again, you have this external deterritorialization, this external melting away of borders, borders between religious institutions or religious bodies. But the other shoe dropping, the consequence of this is that you have a very intense internal territorialization, and that the Anglican Church and the Unitarian Universalists or non-denominational Christians or Baptists or any of the million Protestant churches there are, they agree on very, very little. So the consequence of external deterritorialization, of an external melting away of borders, is an internal strengthening of borders. And you have an inverse of this with New Catholic territoriality. So with New Catholic territoriality, my basic argument is that there is very much a maintaining of borders between the self and the other. And here the self is not only Christianity, but is Catholicism. But you have an internal deterritorialization, an internal melting away of borders, and internal equalization that we see in Cloyters' posthumous honorary Maronitism, that we see in the meeting minutes of the Redemptorists in Lebanon. Now, again, this notion of Protestantization, it's really nothing new. It's very sort of common in discourse, and specifically it's common in discourse which is critical of the Second Vatican Council. I think I showed you why there's a kind of Protestantization inherent to the Second Vatican Council, so I won't repeat myself. But again, my really big claim, or my contention with this notion of Protestantization, is that it's missing something. And what it's missing is that there is a uniquely sort of Catholic territorial logic which maintains heresy, which maintains a distinction between the other and the self, although it does not distinguish between the periphery and the center. So, yes, there is a Protestantization of Catholicism inherent to the Second Vatican Council, but this Protestantization does not simply subsume Catholicism into Protestantism. It creates, I think, a uniquely Catholic Reformation, a uniquely Catholic territorial logic. So my claim is heresy preserves identity, and yeah, of course, for better or for worse, because I don't want to be the kind of guy defending that, yeah, you have this group and you have this group. On the contrary, a lot of my work is about how groups intersect and how people are not mutually exclusive in one group or another, and so forth. But anyway, really this is more of like an ethical point to tell you I'm not sort of defending heresy, that we must always keep heresy in order to have a cohesive a body or a cohesive territoriality. I'm merely, in a sense, stating the fact that I think heresy preserves the kind of cohesion or a unity of a religious or even a national or sectarian or ethnic body. Yeah. So, again, just reminding you of this really central contrast between Howard Bliss and Nicholas Cloyters, between melting away of external borders and melting away of internal borders. And finally, to reiterate my last claim, I really think that the Counter-Reformation really is finished and is really becomes a Counter-Reformation with the Second Vatican Council. And not only this, I think it's the catching up of the Catholic Church on a kind of formal, conscious level of how it conceives of itself and how it organizes itself. It is the catching up of this formal Catholic logic with the conditions of modernity. And again, the conditions of modernity are this secularization, are this melting away, or to put it in Marx's words again, of melting into air. So this condition, which created the process of Protestantism, which is a process of perpetual atomization. Here you have the logic of the Catholic Church catching up to this notion of melting away, of deterritorialization, of equalization, and sort of integrating it into its ecclesiology, while remaining, I think, structurally, inherently, distinctively, definitively Catholic. This was my presentation. I hope you liked it, and let's do questions if you have any.
I have a few questions in mind, but please, if there are others, take the floor.
I didn't grasp the link with Max Weber.
Mm-hmm.
Could you elaborate on that?
Because of course. The idea of the Max Weber thing is that Max Weber was either the first, or I think one of the first, or certainly one of the most prominent, to correlate Protestantism to modernity.
Okay.
And he does so in several aspects. I think within the book itself, he talks about how often Protestant churches are not very decorative, that they don't, for example, or that the way they dress, or that they're very, in a sense, practical. And this practicality, I think, of course, it's about work ethic and so forth, but this practicality, I think, comes from this notion of secularism, of being sort of a disinterested observer, of not being sort of very, of not having sort of vested interest in one side, whether it be Catholic or Orthodox in the sense of the Eastern Orthodox Church, of just being a kind of practical person who, in a way, is just trying to do labor and produce wealth and survive, without having this kind of, I don't know, ethnic or sectarian polemics. Maybe this is one way of putting it. Does that help?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I really liked your presentation. Thank you. I think it was interesting, fascinating for me to hearing you introduce you the term of Protestantization in relation to modernity. But my question was the notion of secularization. How do you connect to that notion? So I think this is also something or important to conceptualize, I think,
absolutely.
if you want to understand.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, I mean, to be frank...
If you want to connect, maybe try to understand the difference between Catholicism and... if you want to understand the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism, as you have.
Again, I use secularization in a kind of broad sense, again, because it's at least on one register an equalization, at least an equalization between sects, or seeing people irregardless of their sects. And the link to Protestantism, and why I think it's a secular Christianity, or it's a sort of secularization of Christianity, is because you can kind of always start a new church based on a critique. And I think critique always implies that, again, you don't have a kind of polemical partisan interest, that you are really just a kind of rationalist, enlightened observer. And also because, like we said, or like I said, there is no Protestant orthodoxy. There's just different Protestant churches that don't really agree on much, whether theologically or ecclesiologically or even politically, but they're all kind of equally Protestant regardless. So I think this is kind of how I'm using the word secularization. And yeah, there's again a secularization within the Catholic Church, like I said, between the peripheral Maronite Church and the central Latin Church, so we say. So I hope this helps or makes sense.
Another conceptual question also. How do you see, I have the have the idea that you somewhat equate orthodoxy and territoriality. How would you describe is the territoriality or territorialization? Is it sort of a manifestation of orthodoxy, or do you really put them on the same level? Just to understand your, very elaborated conceptual framework of it. Huh? But
I don't know, I suppose one way to put it is that, okay, well, orthodoxy can mean a lot of things. If you have a homodoxy, like I said, this kind of complete equalization, it is still an orthodoxy. But I think when we talk about orthodoxy in the sort of older context or old Catholic territoriality, it really establishes, like I said, a center and a periphery within the same territorial body. So within the same territorial body, you kind of have two bodies. Maybe in a way you can think of it like this, it's the difference. Like if I cut off my arm, I say me and my arm, so my arm is kind of a periphery, there's still a me without my arm. Whereas if you cut off my head, will I say me and my head or me and my body?
mm-hmm.
So yeah, this is really to say that with the old Catholic territoriality, although it is still one Catholic entity, you have a periphery and a center. Yeah. Does this help? I hope. Or did I understand your question wrong, maybe?
No, but you related to orthodoxy. Your arm is as orthodox when it's severed from your body as it was still connected.
No, what I mean is that my arm is orthodox, but it's not the emblem of orthodoxy, shall we say. But it is orthodox. But with new Catholic territoriality, you don't have an arm and a body, you have a blob. You have one thing, in one sense. So, yeah, helps?
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
I also have a question. Great presentation, by the way. I was wondering about your methodology. How did you conduct your research?
Yeah.
Where did you start? Did you use only KADOC sources or go elsewhere? Because it's a great, I put in a great research, but I just was wondering about the structure of it all.
Yeah, overwhelmingly, like, at least the documents, this is from KADOC, so you have a lot, like, everything that's a sort of document that you see from an archive, or most of it, sorry, like, these are from the internet, but yeah, everything like this comes from the archive, so yeah, a lot of it is from the archive, and a lot of it was just from the internet, but yeah, I mean, a lot of it I think is just putting these documents into a larger sort of historical context. But as far as my methodology, as in how did I really do it, to be honest, I had an interest, which is ecclesiology, and I went to the archive, I just looked at a lot of documents. And to be honest, I tried a lot of things. I think initially I was planning to work on the Redemptorists and Scout du Liban. But yeah, I didn't end up doing that. So looking at documents and using some of the historical context I know about the Maronite Church, or from my existing interest in Protestantism. And actually, Jonas informed me of the Second Vatican Council, I think when I had started to talk about this notion of equalization between Maronitism and Catholicism, you told me about that. And when he told me about that, really, it was like a key, or like it was in a way sort of concrete proof that, oh, okay, there's really something going on, I'm not projecting. So yeah.
Something you haven't directly referred to, but can be helpful maybe for us to better get grasp of actually what Peter asked you to elaborate, so territoriality, is the reason why the Redemptorists came to Lebanon. Like, I think it is connected with the political and electoral situation in Lebanon at the time that was really driven by religious, a religious demography. This, I think, explains for a large part why they were active in solely Christian or Maronite environments. This explains partly why these Christian-Muslim dialogues weren't in fact dialogues with Muslims, but mainly talking groups within the Christian milieu. So can you maybe explain a bit more about, or elaborate a bit more this political context of the 50s and why the Redemptorists in the first place were there not to, I would say, evangelize, but to strengthen or empower remaining Christian communities.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not too sure about this because, well, I think in the 50s it was no more sectarian or no less sectarian than it is now. I would even maybe say that the electoral laws in Lebanon are maybe a bit more sectarian now because now you have, before the 2000s, Sunnis and Shia were sort of one electoral group. Now they're two. But anyway, I mean, yeah, I don't think
specifically this, how these groups work, I don't think we have much knowledge about the specific workings of Lebanese politics. This can be helpful.
Yeah, I'll try to elaborate as much as I can, but yeah, Lebanon has a sort of representational sectarian democracy. You vote for people, if I'm not mistaken, that are just part of your sect, and then they become representatives, and then the representatives elect a president, and the president has to be Maronite, but the prime minister has to be Sunni, and the speaker of the house has to be Shia. So yeah, it's a democracy, but it's sort of quite sectarian in this sense. There's a lot of people that have written good stuff about it that I can't really talk about now. But yeah, as for the Redemptorists in these Christian areas, for me, and maybe I'm being sort of too easy on them here, but I think to a large extent it's quite circumstantial. I mean, in Lebanon, Christians aren't really like a huge sort of minority. They have, quite a bit of agency and so forth. And it would be quite odd, I think, for the Redemptorists to work largely in these Muslim areas. It really wouldn't make sense because there's this Christian population already present, especially not in the Civil War. Looking at what happened to Kleuters, it makes sense. So yeah, I really think this is quite circumstantial to just there being such a thing as a kind of big Christian area in Lebanon that the Redemptorists can exist in. And plus, they'll be working with churches. There are churches in majority Muslim areas, but of course, they're not very prominent, or people don't really frequent them that much. Maybe it was a bit different in the 50s or 60s, but yeah, generally this is the case. And yeah, and for me, the alignment, for example, with the Christian right, like you see here, I mean, is perhaps ideological on the part of the actual individuals, the individual Redemptorists. Maybe they sort of sympathized with this cause, but I think their intersection with these militias is again circumstantial, is simply due to them functioning in Christian areas, and of course Christian militias will have the most influence in Christian areas, at least in a country like Lebanon, whose geography is to a large extent sectarian. So yeah, I wouldn't go as far as to say, yeah, the Vatican, they're hypocrites. They say we're neutral, but really we're with the phalangists. I think this is just like, I think it's like a bit paranoid. Yeah. So that helps. I don't know.
Yeah. Now I'm paraphrasing something I read myself in one of the Redemptorists' texts, like a summary of the situation where they said there is this fear. I don't know whether this was a real fear or something that they projected on the situation, where there is many refugees coming from neighboring countries, mostly Muslims, and many refugees, Lebanese refugees, leaving the country, mainly Christians.
Right.
So there was this fear of a demographic shift.
It's very, very present still, this fear.
Which would result in a less powerful political position. Is this true? And secondly, is this where the Redemptorists were brought into, and someone like Kleuters, who moved into this Maronite village surrounded by, was this a real catalysator for missionaries to focus on Christian groups instead of evangelizing?
Well, I mean, to speak of their intentions, I don't know. Structurally speaking, that is to a large extent what ends up happening. But yeah, again, maybe it's again being too soft to call it sort of circumstantial. But yeah, it's something that ends up happening. I mean, even someone like Kleuters, again, maybe I'm being way too soft. I don't know. But someone like Reuters is not some sort of fanatic, a Christian fanatic who hates other religions or something. It was like he said in an interview. I didn't put this in the presentation, but it's in the article, that it's very important for him to have Muslims in the church during Mass and so forth. And in terms of keeping Maronites or Christians in Lebanon, to a large extent, this of course strengthens sort of the, whatever, shall we say, Maronite leadership or the Maronite political class. But to be frank, also at the same time, having Maronite diaspora has shown to be really, really important for the Christian right. Like this guy, he's a rich businessman. Where did we find him? Saadi? Yeah. Like this guy, even today, I saw something on Instagram that there's this Maronite institution in the US. And, they do events and they